In the next of our series of next generation leaps, we hit the storage solutions, and this is likely going to be the biggest impact for both consoles. The SSD is really a paradigm change. Now, we need to be clear here that the improvement is not just from an SSD. As many of you know, I have covered previously with my SSD replacement in the PS4 on the Pro, linked below and on screen, an average of 25% increase from a drive that is over 4 times faster. It's not a great return now, is it? Now, I discuss much of hard drive tech and challenges with mechanical drives and data in that video from 2016, but I think a brief hardware and software engineering lesson is perfect to summarise. The current chip drives and consoles rotate at a maximum rotation speed of 7200 RPM. The stock drives are often slower at 5400. Now, alongside this is an ARM that reads from the spindles, the platters, the sectors and tracks that the data is stored within. Think of this like a record player. Remember them? Yeah, I still use mine. Anyway, like that device, if you just have all your data sequential on the disk, contiguous blocks, just as music tracks, then it just reads it at a constant rate. It's maximum level. Recall though, for games, the majority of the hard drive access is one-way traffic, reading data from disk into RAM. Saving data such as save points are far smaller, less frequent, and thus not as performant in action, which they do not have to be. It's also partially why installing from disks is quite slow as a task. Now, if we keep that analogy of the record player spinning for now, then so long as what we want next is on the same track or close by, we get the maximum read speed from that drive. The further out to the edge you are, the better. But if we need to get a chunk of data stored miles away in relative terms on the disk in another sector, then we need to wait for 2 things to happen. The ARM to lift and move to that sector, and the disk to rotate around to the track where the data is so we can start to read it. Now, all the time this takes is called seek time, something I've discussed with real examples in my Jedi Fallen Order analysis last year. Now, this does not include the read and copy time, only the time it takes to get that first page of data required. The quicker this is, the better. Now, this is why index tables or MBR, master boot records, are vital. They are a vast structure, partition and location search, almost like a digital yellow pages, another blast from the past. These tell you where the data is. Now, the CPU will then instruct the I/O controller to retrieve the data and bring it into RAM. Depending on all the things above, the ARM will seek out the right sector and the track, and it will then commence reading from it. Now, all the time this is taking place, the CPU is waiting, or most likely in modern games, puts the request thread to sleep, and it's moved on to other tasks that do not require this data. Now, this is bad for performance and requires a lot of work to mitigate this within your game loop, predicting when and where you need the data, limiting your RAM pool to store it. Now, for the CPU and the GPU, they can only start working on any data when it's off the drive and into RAM. Think of the disk as a bookcase. You can see the books, but you need to take them out before you can learn from them, a page at a time. Now, once the data is ready, the CPU has to pick up where it left off and finish the job, only to repeat perpetually while the loop is active. Now, if you take all of these issues and place them into something as dynamic as a game, then you quickly see the hoops programmers are jumping through all the time. Now, in the best case scenario, a 7200 RPM drive, the outer edge read, will read approximately 120 megabytes per second from a large single file. You can see examples off screen from the excellent Crystal Disk Mark, which you can download and do for free to check out how fast your drive is on your PC. But this is best case scenario. If you need lots of little files, then the performance drops through the floor, maybe 4 or 5 megabytes per second. Now, these operations of moving data back and forth within the input and output bus are called IOPS. And just like teraflops, these are the amount of operations per second you can chug through. The slower you take to get to the data and then move it, the lower this becomes. As I do not want to go into other areas such as queue depth and thread count, something I work with a great deal actually in vast data stores within ERPs and CRM systems, and as such I work with SANs, which generally aid reads massively, and less so for obvious reasons where sequential writes and data structures are concerned. But this is getting into RAID territory, and like I say, I'm just going to skip over all this. The main rule is when it comes to reading data, the larger your file source is, the better, and the closer your data is, the better. This is why almost all games duplicate assets, samples, textures and more within the game files. And it's also the cause of why file sizes this gen have grown to over 100 gigabytes. In addition, when a file is installed, including patches, this is then sorted into order on the disk to ensure the libraries of content are as close together and structured as designed. Remember this screen back in the day? Our overnight runs to boost performance on our hard drives. The PlayStation copying file after it is installed is the modern day equivalent of the defrag, without the hypnotizing bit block flashing. You see, by doing this, they are working around or reducing the impact the seek time and rotation time or latency as it has on the system, which can be upwards of 5 to 30 milliseconds, almost an entire frame at 30 FPS and 2 at 60. This is an enormous enough amount of impact to kill your performance alone, all on its own. And this doesn't even include the copy time. Now let's assume we're hitting a large 400 megabyte file and we're getting absolute best case of 100 megabytes per second read from that file. It will take us 4 seconds to get that data from the disk and into RAM. Other things have to happen, such as validating the source, cyclic redundancy checks or CRCs, and then pointers, etc., which all put more load on the CPU to manage within its billion other jobs, and worst of all, it adds time. Now the net result is, if you are flying over a cityscape in a plane or swinging through a dense metropolis as Spider-Man, then you have to pick one or all of the below as a developer. You either limit the quality or the density of those assets, i.e. make them smaller in size. You limit the speed at which you can travel, which happens a lot. You block the view ahead by large objects to reduce draws on screen, all those elevator journeys as Mark Cerny mentions, or you insert a squeeze through, a door opening or other slowdown to allow this to load in while it plays through, just like the Resident Evil doors back in the day. Now note, not all these occur for that very reason. They sometimes occur for other reasons. It's not all about data loading. And the last is you store far more data in RAM than you really need, i.e. you waste it. Now most likely all of those are being used, and maybe others within the game and engine. Now, if we need 1 gigabyte of new data to be loaded into RAM and then worked on to draw a collection of new objects, materials, sound effects, or even music files, and even a complete mesh of a model to be used either large scale or duplicated across the rendered frame, then in a 60 FPS title we need to be asking for this around 600 frames or over 10,000 milliseconds before we need to show it. At best case scenario, and that can't really happen as a baseline. It actually gets worse. Now this of course is not as easy as it sounds. I'm obviously being sarcastic there. And thus memory is used to store huge portions of data that may or may not be needed over the next 15-30 seconds of play, or maybe even more. In modern games, the texture system or texels are now mostly virtualized. This means they do not all remain resident in RAM, and developers don't have to manage them at a micro level, with large texture canvases or tiles created to cover the entire MIP chain. Now these are just smaller quality versions of the same asset you see at further distances from view. These can start at 4096 by 4096 on the current generation, and then move down from there in the process required to 2048 by 2048, all the way down to 64 by 64, maybe even 32 by 32. Now this is simply requested by the CPU, and if the bigger version is not yet in RAM, then the smaller one is, which actually may still be in cache if you're lucky, or is already loaded into RAM as it is the smallest size and will likely land first. You see this all day, every day in games, and I've covered for years. These low quality soupy rocks that clean up after a few seconds as if you've just rubbed your eyes. Everyone remembers the mega textures from mid-tech 6 and mid-tech 5. This essentially is it in its worst case scenario. In fact, we're almost going back to that now, but I digress. Artists can control the chain here and the bias of the level these are drawn in, but keeping the smaller ones for longer and closer helps data flow at the cost of detail in view, something I'm sure many of you have noticed in games. And this is just textures. The hard drive is being asked at all times in modern games to keep feeding the data into RAM with a JIT process, just in time. A digital juggling act of new for old, although the used data is only expunged from RAM and does not need to return to the drive most of the time. Again, like I say, one-way traffic. Now beyond all this, other aspects have to be managed by the engine programmers or designers within their workloads. setting up sector points throughout the game that trigger a new load of data or removal of old data. This memalloc and free process is ongoing and can have its own impact and issues, but I will skip all that for now for the ease of this discussion. The main area is that if you need to draw an NPC or a car or a building, you will need to know way ahead of time when you need it, or use a huge portion of your RAM just to keep this in there and all other things resident when you do, or if you do. Now, this is why I always say that devs will always ask for more RAM, as more RAM makes your life easier. And if not RAM, then a fast cache to feed from will really, really, really help. Now, as I covered in my SSD replacement tests, and you can also see in my PC gaming sections, the main benefit you notice from changing to an SSD from a mechanical hard drive in current systems is those load times. Now, this is because you are no longer working at your slowest point, as this is no longer the disk source in consoles. It moves to the CPU or the bandwidth of your RAM or the I/O port itself. Now, SATA 3 is good for 6 gigabits per second or 750 megabytes at best, which should leave the limit in the Pro at the CPU. Now, this means when all factors are in line, we see 38% on the tested games at best, which is largely down to the CPU, the API, and the entire construction of the system. Again, you're only as good as your slowest point. I know I'm getting boring, but I keep stressing this to people all the time for obvious reasons. But all the issues I just explained above are still hard-coded, or, in some circles of speak, baked into the game engine at source. Now, this, be it an Xbox One, a PS4, or top-end PC with a PCIe 4.0 NVMe drive, you will only be as quick as the code allows, and you will only have resident in RAM the allocations made by the programmers or dynamically shifted to a limit as set within that code. Now, for consoles, this is one single unified pool, and for PC, this is two pools split up by your relevant PCIe port. Again, I've covered in my teraflops or a live video. You see, in PC games, when you load a new game, you can see how it fills the system RAM up with all the required data, and then it opens the valve to leak this into the VRAM. For PC, this chain of requests can be affected by the speed of your system RAM, which is where you can see in game tests when increasing RAM speeds improves performance. This adds an extra level of complexity to that format and means if you start using the SSD directly in PC games, you are still limited by the slowest part of this abstraction of pools creates. Now, like console, PC developers cannot target an SSD as most of the market do not have one, aside some examples that are still in eternal development hell. Now, long story short, this means that console and PC are only as fast as the code allows, and thus stick the very best SSD or NVMe into a machine and it will only offer a percentage of that real life performance in reality, with game streaming being the most important and largely still the weakest. Even if your drive can support 3.5 gigabytes per second, or in my case 3.4 as my NVMe drive here can and does, this means that little, if it's only asked to drip feed data at megabytes per second at a time over fixed data points and intervals, along with the impact of the API, the OS, and other such areas beyond this video's scope. Now, step forward next gen consoles and those centralized I/O improvements and SSDs. Microsoft and Sony have made great leaps here, and what they are trying to do, rather than just increase GPU power alone and RAM sizes, which they have done, instead the focus has also been on the single slowest point all these systems share since we moved away from the cartridge format. Now, I'm not going to get into any war or warrior territory in this video. Both are making giant leaps here, and there is no argument that Sony has invested more in this area than Microsoft, with Microsoft investing more of its allocation to the GPU portion. That's the choices, them's the businesses, they are the ones that make the choices. The net result is both machines are vastly in excess of the current generation and PC market. Now, let's summarize the spec and details of each so we are clear on just how big this is. Now, on sheer numbers, the SeriesX has a whopping 2.4 gigabytes per second raw bandwidth to play with. But they know that this alone will only be a short-lived benefit. As you just saw, we can already exceed that level on PC right now, which means you need to increase this to offer a bigger and longer leap for the years to come. The SeriesX launches with some new changes, and this is all wrapped up in the Xbox Velocity architecture, a collection of APIs and hardware that is at the heart of this, which comprise of the following. The Direct Storage API is a brand new I/O application programming interface. It's designed specifically for gaming requirements, as I've just described. Now, this will be unique and brand new for the Series X and will also be added to DirectX 12 so the PC market can follow suit. Now, this still runs on the CPU, but just like DirectX 11 and Vulkan, it's reducing the CPU workload and threads with batching, etc. This will also reduce the impact on the CPU from what it is now, and it's an absolute necessity when you realize the leap of throughput it will now need to support. Now, in addition to this, we have hardware decompression, and this again is a necessity to reduce the footprint of game files on the SSD by compressing them into smaller files until needed in RAM. And this is all done in new hardware, as the name suggests. It's a dedicated hardware component within the chipset on Series X. Now, taking all of the work of a runtime decompression off the CPU so it can just run the game and manage the actual data requests and loads via the new DS API. Now, the textures will be using the new BC Pack format that is still not ready for prime time as yet, but this will again help due to the leap in texture sizes we are going to see this generation and will enable lossless block compressed assets. And probably the biggest requirement is another new element in DirectX 12 Ultimate and in the Series X, and that is sampler feedback streaming, SFS. This is another new feature of the Series X hardware that allows games to load into memory as required, building on the partially resident textures we saw this generation, but with greater finesse coming from the GPU sampling hardware on texture use and predicting the actual requirements. It will reduce the texture canvas as much as possible to reduce the RAM footprint even more, and thus those bandwidth requirements. Again, like the hardware compression, this is vital for both consoles and PC as we leap up from 4K to 8K textures, lots of them, as we saw in the recent Unreal 5 demo. This is 16 megabytes a piece. 8K textures. These will quickly add up when you're swamping the screen with them. Now, like compression technology, this will vary on a workload to workload basis, but a 2 times improvement would be a realistic expectation for many high impact textures such as scenery or character models. Now, all of these complete with that brand spanking new SSD in the console means that 2.4 gigabytes per second can be doubled to 4.8 gigabytes per second. When that data is compressed well and all those components come together, this will be a vast improvement over what we have now. And as I stated, it's only possible now for the PC space as the APIs and engines will now be able to target this as a real option. If you have a decent SSD, be it an NVMe or a SATA 600, you will see the benefit from it even more once those games start using it with DirectX 12 and such. Now, the PS5 is very similar in much of this, as they have their own APIs in GNM and their higher abstraction in GNMX, which helps DirectX ports. Again, I discussed this many moons ago. They will also improve all their APIs to take advantage of the new hardware options and core I/O construction of the console, some of which we have just seen in that Unreal Engine 5 demo. Now, as the PSSL shader language already supports partially resident textures in the PS4 and other options, this will be an area they will also need and almost certainly will have been working on to maximize the potential of the new machines. Again, like the SFS elements, oh my god, these terminologies. Like the SFS elements of the Series X, this will enable textures to be partially loaded to reduce footprint and bandwidth. If the hardware sampling block remains on the GPU is unknown, but now, since both companies work in the same space, they likely know the same challenges equally as much as the other, so I wouldn't be surprised if they haven't spent a great deal of time working on this as well. Now, the change here from the Series X is the SSD is accompanied by the big investment Sony have made with the entire input and output construction of the system, starting with that dedicated 12 channels of flash memory alongside the SSD. That delivers a 5.5 gigabytes per second bandwidth in raw uncompressed format. Now, the new compression in Kraken will also be included here too for textures. Remember, the Series X is using the BC Pack here, as I just mentioned. Now, this is again a dedicated hardware block within the SoC that takes all this decompression work away from the CPU so it can concentrate on other workloads, just like the Series X. Now, the Kraken unit itself is able to be fed from that 5.5 gigabytes per second input and therefore can turn that into 9 gigabytes output at present. We are told it can maintain more, but this is a realistic level at present. And again, as on Series X, this is a necessity As the data requirements go up and throughput speeds increase, the current impact for 100 megabytes a second moving 100 times that would mean that both console and PC CPUs would be doing nothing but decompressing all that data per frame. This is an area on PC we'll have to discuss at a later time. The benefit of the PS5 has over the Series X here though, and many will say came at the cost of the GPU size, is the entire offloaded I/O and memory mapping workloads. Now, as I just described on the Series X, this only offloads the decompression work from the CPU. The file requests, the mapping and checking still all happen within the CPU core. Admittedly, they are much better CPUs as I've already covered. Now, none of this is on the PS5 CPU. The DMA controller can communicate with the SSD controller to allocate memory virtually itself, and all the file checks and management along with mapping to page tables is all done within the two dedicated co-processors alongside another pool of SRAM, which feeds through the SSD, and it's likely a faster local cache that ties into the other feature this entire memory subsystem has in those GPU scrubbers. Now, this is a big impact on games. And code overall is stale pointers. Now, in C++, the old joke is very true, and it goes a little something like this. How do you know which language you are coding in? You shoot yourself in the foot. And with C++, you can see the joke on screen. It's very true. What this means is C++ uses pointers to memory addresses and data. It doesn't keep moving the data around. It just points other objects and program code at it, so you go and do the work over there. If the data isn't where you've told it is, you've got a problem. Now, with the new SSD cache and virtual mapping of data, the impact of having a stale or wrong data within your cache is costly. It's probably going to be even more costly than it is now. Now, cache misses are the bane of performance, and flushing them is a huge cost to performance. The GPU scrubbers alongside the coherency engine hardware will maintain a link to the address registers that have old data and enable them to be removed discreetly at a line level ahead of time. This greatly reduces the impact all this new I/O system and choice offers. Now, as all good APIs need to be, this is all managed away from the developers as they just map files and make requests as normal, and the entire subsystem works out the rest for them. This will be similar to the direct storage APIs we've just discussed on the Series X. You see, forcing programmers to jump through more hoops at the start of a generation is a surefire way to lessen the impact of any new feature and its adoption. Now, all these areas on the PS5 means that 5.5 gigabytes per second can become 8 or 9 gigabytes a second. Again, though, I will say this will vary on a workload to workload basis, but it's less than a 2 times improvement, so it's not that far from reality, I'm sure. Obviously, there's a great deal more to all of this than what I've just discussed, such as the data source priority. Think of this like old school IRQ requests. If something is of a higher priority, then the controller on the SSD can move those requests to up the queue and get that data out first. Both Series X and PS5 will have upgrade options, but they have taken 2 separate paths. Series X have partnered with Seagate to create an old school memory card device that are actually brand spanking new SSDs encased with a heatsink to keep them cool. Remember, this is a big problem both teams are taking seriously, as it's not only the SoC that needs cooling. All this RAM and flash RAM devices create heat. NVMEs are affected by heat massively and performance thus lowers, so I'm really looking forward to seeing more on how they both have achieved this and the levels we see once tested. Sony are following their own trend they set with the PS4 with internal replacements only. Now, lists come out as a PCIe 4.0 is now on the market. They recommend a 7 gigabytes per second device, which you probably can't find at the moment, but this will likely be the baseline to match the shipped SSG due to that priority queue logic within the controller I've just discussed. So what does all this mean to us then, the gamers? And is this really a special sauce, as some love to call it? The real answer is we don't know. All this info is going to shake out and how the real world situations come to pass. I can't tell you without a shadow of a doubt what that's going to work out, but what I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, results may and will vary from team to team. But I will be here day one on both machines telling you the facts as they are rendered in real time. The truth is, we could see here, and what we could see, I stress this, I am sure will at times have one machine or workload favour the other. The investment in the I/O alongside the SSD from Sony is going to show differences at times. Those small stutters or hitches may occur on Series X and not on PS5, or detail may be toned down slightly to compensate. Now in balance, I suspect, as I've said before, that the Series X will likely render at a slightly higher resolution and ray traced effects may be improved in quality over the PS5. All this is guesswork for now though, as this is how the PC market will really be affected. This is another area we need to discuss, and just what those hard drive requirements or RAM requirements will do, and they'll move the system and the environment around 12 months from now into the next gen, when teams have started to fully adopt the shift in. It is an exciting time ahead, and it is a generation that I am really excited for, as not only do we have two machines that are not identical in specs or aims, but the changes they have both made will hopefully enable great shifts in gameplay and choice over just prettier graphics and shiny reflections. And for that, I'm going to take a front row seat. Now, I hope you enjoyed this, and if so, please like, subscribe and share, as it really helps, and I need your support to grow the channel and its impact. I thank all of you that have supported me over the past 7 years. Yeah, it's been that long already. And here's to the next 7 years of this generation and this channel. Now, if you're hungry for more next-gen action, then check out my other PS4, Xbox Series X videos, GPU, CPU, teraflops are a lie, and Unreal 5 videos and more. But until next time, when we do go fully next-gen, I'm out. I'll catch you on the next one.